I'd love for you to go to the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, chapter number 6. It's been an exciting weekend. We had the opportunity to come and join the fellowship, the compañerismo in East Texas, in teaching through the Bible. And the theme or the subjects that we were covering for this weekend, it was kind of a team effort. It was precisely on the renewal, the commitment and the renewal to teach and to disciple. And you know, for me, this is a very special topic for multiple reasons. Obviously, the Bible presents this as a lifestyle, not just as an event. But before I take you into Deuteronomy, I got a couple of things that I want to ask you to do for us. And the first one is, is two things. One has to do with the download of a couple of apps on your phone. So if you have a phone, a tablet, I'd love for you to go to your app store, whatever it is that you get your apps from. And if you can search for Texas Baptist with an S, it's a plural, Baptist. I'd love for you to download the app of Texas Baptist for multiple reasons. One of them has to do obviously with communication, engagement. We'd love for you guys to be connected to everything that happens across the state. And again, this gathering this weekend has been a gathering of about 12 churches that came together in East Texas, specifically at Primera Iglesia Bautista in Jacksonville, Texas. And it's just been a celebration. Baptists coming together, right, under the teaching and the preaching of the Bible. So the app is going to allow you to see and to, again, get connected to what is taking place, resources, and I can give you so many examples over some of the things that are taking place across the state of Texas. So please help us. Just go and download on your phone the app of Texas Baptist. The second app, as you guys see on the screen, is Bible Lessons International. Again, just search on your app store and again, get the resources, get access to free resources, biblical resources, multiple things that you can definitely utilize for your personal development, for ministry, or simply just share those apps with families, friends, church pastors, whatever your network of friends and family. Love for you guys to do that as well. As I think of the book of Deuteronomy and specifically this little exercise that we did, I have done this weekend with the churches across East Texas, precisely is called Learning Our Faith in God. And I'm taking you right now into my early years of seminary training. So we're looking at 22 years ago, approximately. I'm walking into seminary for the first time, and one of the first courses that I took was precisely a New Testament course. One of my favorite professors, Dr. Ken Huggins. Shout out to Dr. Huggins. And he presented this little exercise, which again is called Learning Our Faith in God. And you can tell, I mean, it's been over 20 years that I have utilized this exercise, this packaging and presentation of how we learn our faith in God. And this is extremely important because 20 plus years ago, you know, we were in our early years of marriage, and our kids, I began my seminary when my second child was born, Rebecca was born, and I began going to school, going through my theological training. Josue, our third child, was born kind of in the middle of the process. But to think about 20 plus years ago, I'm more than convinced, and I don't know if you can agree with me on this, on how we learn our faith. I feel that 20 plus years ago, we as a culture, when it came to religious issues, faith issues, spiritual issues, I think the question was primarily whether it was true or not. So there was still the debate of, you know, morality and truthfulness and falsehood and counterfeit, you know, experiences, which I think still exist today. I think that we are in a different stage today. So when East Texas, Nueva Esperanza, Compañerismo, Fellowship, Baptist Gathering of Churches invited us and gave us the topics, the subjects, and it had to do with the renewal, the commitment of teaching and learning. Unavoidably, I'm thinking as a parent, I'm thinking as a pastor, I'm thinking as a middle-aged person, looking at the, again, a younger generation, the upcoming generation. And I'm thinking, okay, so if 20 plus years ago, the issue was, when it came to spiritual issues or learning the faith, about truthfulness, authenticity, making sure that you are in the right path, that your faith is placed in the proper object of that faith, which in this case obviously is God. I believe that today the challenge is not necessarily whether it's true or not. I think the question that people are asking today is, does it work? Does your faith, does your religion work? When you look at the world, and you look at the diversity, you look at the beauty of what is taking place, but also the challenges, because truthfulness has become so relativistic. We are in a time and age where, as you know, that potentially the only sin that you can potentially, bring into the conversation is to say that there's sin. In other words, we're in a time and age where everything is permissible, everything is embraceable, everything goes, right? Because who am I to limit your authenticity and your values? And anyway, so the point that I'm trying to make is, since things have changed, and again, 20 plus years ago, Dr. Ken Huggins introducing these principles and this little exercise for us, I did, and I'm presenting this over the weekend to pastors and churches, but I'm switching the focus again, because I just don't think that the focus necessarily is still, whether it's true or not, as important as it is. But I think the focus is, does it work? I think that's what people are asking. In a pluralistic society, we got a society again that I'm thinking that multiplicity of views when it comes to spiritual matters, religions, backgrounds, idiosyncrasies, and worldviews, and everything is supposed to be acceptable. So they just want to find, a lot of our kids, a lot of our people in church are coming and trying, our experiences when it comes to spiritual matters, asking the question, is it going to work? So it is extremely important for us to really realize this. I was listening to some podcasts recently, and based on the studies that had been done, especially after COVID and things like that, the de-church, those people who used to be in church, grew up in church, and are no longer in church, and you know exactly who I'm talking about. Apparently in the United States, you're looking at 40 million people. And I think, again, I'm just speaking with a lot of biases and preconceived ideas. Unavoidably, I'm seeing this through my personal lenses of 20 plus years ago when I began this journey of marriage and parenting and ministry and all these kind of experiences. And where we are today, I think that's exactly where we are today. I mean, in a sense that, I'm trying for us to really see if or since we are committed, again, that was the focus of the weekend, if we're committed to teach the Bible, if we're committed to disciple one another, we have to consider how people learn their faith. In part of the learning of the faith in the culture that we lived in, you got to wrestle with this question whether we like it or not. Well, back in the Old Testament, going back into, again, Moses and what we might call the sermons of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is speaking to a brand new generation, which I'm going to make the assumption that they had a different perspective of life from what Moses had and the parents had, which they die in the wilderness, as you guys know the story. And Moses, what he's going to do, and this is what is called the Shema. This is Moses reintroducing the law, recapturing the understanding that as they have navigated for 40 years, again, the wilderness, and Moses setting the foundation of how to disciple the nations, because I think that's what the Exodus is about. It's about the discipling of the nations, creating the blueprint. Now, this is the time for the fulfillment of the promise, which is, in this case, part of the promise, or one of the central focus of the promise, is precisely the understanding of the promised land. They're about to enter the promised land, and in this experience of possessing the land, Moses wants to make sure that they understand the centrality of basically gospel presentation, the uniqueness of one true God. They're coming from 400 years of slavery in Egypt, of polytheism, and they're moving into a land which is filled with deities and multiplicity, pluralistic, right? Come back into the same conversation. That's where we are today. A lot of pluralism. Everything goes. Every religion should work, or as long as it works, man, we're going to make it happen. So the question is, how did Moses do that? How did he consider how these people learn their faith? How is Moses introducing or discipling, making the commitment for this message, for the centrality of the one true God to become the object of their experiences and the object of the possessing of the land? Well, again, we don't have the time to go into the details. I love for you to read this on your own. I'm not going to give you the verses today, but this is kind of the framework where we are. Now, if you were to just, again, fast forward the experience and then move into the New Testament, which, by the way, The New Testament, man, come on, the Greco-Roman world, extremely pluralistic. Once again, I think, and my understanding of the Roman culture is that they were not against either Christianity or any other religious practice in their time in history, as long as they would not present it as the only way to do this. So the Romans were willing to negotiate and to come alongside and embrace that pluralism, that diversity in beliefs and practices, as long as everything was acceptable, because the question wasn't necessarily whether it was true or not. The question was, does it work? And now, how do you navigate this? How do you navigate this culture, speaking of the New Testament, specifically through the person and the character of Jesus, through the teaching of the apostles, and eventually through the local church? How do you do that? Exactly. I think exactly, as we gather this weekend and as we, again, spend time in fellowshipping and learning and worshiping and just seeing pastors and churches coming together in East Texas, how do you do this? Well, the little exercise is based on the resurrection of Jesus, because obviously, as you guys know, that's going to be a turning point, and it's going to make a difference across any religion, not only in who the person of Jesus is, but specifically the life of Jesus. And I'm bringing the life of Jesus because, as you know, the gospel is not simply the death and resurrection of Christ. That's central and non-negotiable. But the gospel is also the life of Jesus. So it's not just how he died and when he died, and that he actually came alive and resurrected. But you guys understand, and you and I agree, that the resurrection of Jesus is primarily based on his obedience to the law, on how he lived for 33 years. So the life of Jesus, the perfection, the submission, the fact that he was sinlessness, that guaranteed the resurrection. The struggle is going to be 2,000 years ago, just like Moses at the very beginning of the narrative, possessing the land, is the ability to actually understand the exclusivity of the gospel, focus on the uniqueness of the one true God, that in this case now by the New Testament, this progressiveness of the revelation, now understanding that the one who came and died, lived and died and resurrected, literally was God himself, is the incarnation, is literally, again, the person of God walking among ourselves. So once again, the question is, how did they do that? And if you look at this, it begins with asking the question of the explanation. What are the facts? And again, just because of time, I'm not able to read all of these Bible verses, but if you get a chance, just go through these Bible verses and look at the factual experience that when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus has been documented, and has been presented in a manner that you don't need faith to actually believe that Jesus came from the dead. And I'm saying this because, once again, as important as faith is needed to ultimately believe in this factual experience, at this point, after all this year, it's been documented historically and archaeologically. And again, you can see that from multiple angles. The bottom line is this. The bottom line is that the Bible itself is going to give you factual expressions, factual presentations of the actual reality, that there was a Jewish carpenter, there was a Jewish man who actually walked among us. And in his walking among us, he actually went to a Roman cross and he died, was buried, and then he came out of the graveside. That is factual. So once you get into that conversation, and again, I'm thinking as a parent, I'm thinking of 20 plus years ago, my kids were just, coming into the picture. And then now as young adults, the world that they're navigating, you have to begin with factual things. And you have to document those things. You have to understand that God has given us the ability to understand. This is why we invest time in studying the scriptures. This is why we're committed to study. In other words, as important and as foundational as the revelation and the grace of God that reveals, gives us that ability to actually, we call this illumination, to understand the gospel and to be able to respond to the gospel, we have to understand what is it that we're responding to. And this is why, again, this weekend has been the teaching, the commitment and to the renewal, the commitment to the actual understanding of, in this case, evangelism and discipleship, how we teach the Bible and how we disciple one another. So again, the concept of learning, extremely important. So the first thing that you need to know is explanation. What are the facts? The second thing that you want to do is the interpretation. So here I'm presenting the factual things. I'm presenting the things that are non-negotiable. Now we're going to give each other the freedom. Again, I'm thinking Moses. Moses is speaking as the older guy, speaking to a younger generation, a generational gap, which many of us, that's exactly where we are. Multiple views over the things. So here are the facts. Moses speaking in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Here's factual. There is only, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. That's a fact. You cannot negotiate that. For us, New Testament, same concept, now translated or reflected. In this case, the exercise is taking us into the factual thing that Jesus is alive. And once you get into that and you establish that, the second experience, the second step has to do with interpretation. And the question is, what is it that these facts, in this case the resurrection, in this case the Shema, what do they mean? So we're going to give each other the freedom to process that. See, in the New Testament, you're going to find multiple expressions, multiple interpretations of the facts. And again, I love to have the time to read this to you, but from the Great Commission and the appearance of Jesus to what we believe is the 500, it's Corinthians, I think. First Corinthians is going to document this, or Paul is going to make reference to the appearance to 500, because as you know, Matthew 28 is a Great Commission. And then you're going to see Jesus' interpretation. And you're going to go into Luke chapter 24. This is the experience of those two individuals walking towards Emmaus, and Jesus shows up and start developing and start presenting or introducing the facts that Jesus' resurrection is the fulfillment of, in this case, Old Testament history, eventually pointing towards this, again, factual event. And then you get Peter's interpretation. Peter preaching the first sermon, chapter 2 of the book of Acts, and he's going to give his account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ultimately, you get to, again, one of the most influential personality, apostle in the New Testament, which is Paul, and he's going to begin his defense in the book of Romans, speaking of this experience of, and again, this is part of his, apostolic authority, that he's going to remind us that although he was not an eyewitness, for what we understand, of the teaching and the ministry of Jesus while he was on earth, the one who appeared to him, the one that showed up to him on the road to Damascus, this is Acts chapter 9, is precisely the resurrected Christ. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that you are seeing 4 different angles of the factual experience. So once again, go back into Deuteronomy, and in the Shema, the one true God, Moses is going to give people the freedom to see it from multiple angles. And today, again, just thinking of the weekend, a couple of hundreds of people gathered together for this celebration of the fellowship, the compañerismo. It's exactly the same thing. You present the message and you give people the freedom, the room to process and to interpret what they are hearing, what they are taking, as long as they don't negotiate the content, the object of the interpretation. I don't know if that makes sense. See, the object, in this case, the resurrection, Deuteronomy, the Shema, the one true God, those they just cannot negotiate that, right? Cannot negotiate that, yet you're going to give people the freedom to interpret the same experience, the same factual things in multiple views, affirming, now here's the thing, the experience, the interpretation is affirming, is getting to the same place, is the fact that Jesus is alive. Number 3 is the application. And the application now, this is where it gets a little personal, because the question is, how can these facts affect my life? So once again, I'm speaking to my kids, I'm speaking to my grandkids, I'm speaking to a younger generation, older generation. We just came back from Stavanger in Norway from the Baptist World Alliance. So you get, oh my goodness, you get, speaking of diversity, 84 countries represented, and so we're coming into the factual thing, we're allowing freedom, we're giving each other the freedom to interpret the facts, but now we're coming to the personal thing. So now tell me how this thing, Old Testament, one true God, New Testament, the resurrected God, what does that mean for you at a personal level? How can these facts affect my life? Now, when it comes to Paul, because this is going to be obviously, again, the guy that is going to write most of the, a lot of books, a lot of writings from the New Testament. The New Testament is specifically, which I see so much similarity from the Old Testament, and going back into Moses and speaking to a generation who is about to possess the land, and tragically they're not going to listen, and you guys probably know the story. Paul, the apostles, are kind of in the same scenario, because the churches got to the place in the New Testament where their interpretation, or their freedom to interpret things, became the central point. Interpretation of things, our ability to process things, it's got to be the vehicle towards the object. The object has to be the character of God, God being revealed to us. And I'm saying this because once these churches negotiated doctrine, negotiated the character of God, negotiated the things that were not supposed to be negotiated, that's where the door was opened for the infiltration of false teaching and false doctrines. And this is why this little exercise helps us to remind ourselves that as important as it is for us to exercise the ability of free will, the ability to make choices, the ability to believe things, ultimately that's not the goal. The goal is the object of our decision making. The goal is, where is our choices going to be placed, the object, the reason. And again, I think this is exactly why Paul is going to launch into this, apologetics, defending of the faith. And he gets to this place in the book of Corinthians, which ironically, at the end of this back and forth with the church in the defense of the faith, a church that was in a lot of confusion, precisely, he's going to get to this chapter 15, giving a defense of the faith at a personal level. And he's answering the question, how can these facts affect my life? So let me just again retake what we're trying to do with this little exercise. So this is the third section of the exercise. We presented the facts with conviction, understanding that this is truth. It's not just, the question is not, does it work? The question is this actual veracity? Is this actual factual, has factual, content on this? We gave each other the freedom to interpret this based on where you are, where you're coming from, what happened to you, your story, your narrative, whatever the case may be. Let's talk about it. But once we get there and we open up the conversation, eventually, as a pastor, as a parent, as a grandparent, eventually as a brother, I have to tell you how these factual things are beyond simply the knowledge or the affirmation or the exercising of my freedom to make choices. They make a difference at a personal level. And this is why Paul gets to the place in chapter 15, beginning in verse 17, when he says, and if Christ, here's the bottom line, if Christ has not been raised, this is what it means to me. Now, I'm giving you the freedom to process the resurrection, and in this case for the Corinthians, they're choosing not to believe. And Paul obviously has no control over whether they're going to believe. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. Whether they're going to believe, and in this case, in the Old Testament, when it comes to the Shema, when it comes to Moses reintroducing the law, Moses has no control whether they're going to obey or not going to obey. But Moses is going to, just like the Apostle Paul, they're going to give you the personal understanding that if you were to choose to reject the factual things, if you were to choose to go against the character of God, I need to tell you the consequences as well. I need to tell you what's going to happen. And in this case, Paul says, hey, if Christ has not been raised, your faith and my faith are worthless. They're pointless. And this is what it means. The meaning of that is that you are still in your sins. Now, you got to remember, Paul is writing to Christians. He's speaking to the church. And the church is struggling with these things. Now, I'm going to make the assumption, this is just me, understanding the passage, that part of the problem with the church 2,000 years ago, and I think this is exactly where we are today, is that they had no issue with sin. Because, see, here's what I'm trying to say. Once you disregard, once you negotiate the character of God, everything goes. Once the holiness of God is negotiated, sin becomes negotiable as well. I will even argue that sin potentially disappears of the conversation, because if there is no holiness of God, then there is no sinfulness on man. This is why in today's culture, tragically, where the question is not whether it's true or not, the question is whether does it work or not, is based on the fact that we get this, and some of you remember, this is from the sociologist Christian Smith back in the early 2000s, and he came out with the phrase of the moralistic therapeutic deism. which implies if there is a God, he exists for my well-being. Not necessarily holy. Yes, he's not the God that needs to be feared, but he's just a God, or God who is to bless me, protect me, and help me to make sense of life. Well, you and I know that's exactly the opposite of what the Bible teaches. And in this case, once again, he speaks of the futility, the worthlessness of faith if Christ is not raised. And the deeper issue is that you are still in trouble with the holiness of God, because sin, as we know, sin is nothing else but simply, the issue of sin is not just sinfulness and our tendency to disobey God. The issue of sin is God, is his holiness and his righteousness. Well, on verse 18, he also expands the explanation by saying, hey, then also those who have fallen asleep in Christ, they have perished. In other words, there is no, as important as your faith is, and obviously he's speaking to a generation of faith. Moses was speaking to a religious generation that came from a lot of faith practices in Egypt for 400 years. He's speaking to a generation that is about to possess a land and that is filled with a lot of faith experiences. And I'm going to say this again. As important as faith is, what really, really matters is the object of the faith. And this is why Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, is going to speak of the one true God. So your faith is placed in the uniqueness. Your faith is placed in literally the exclusivity of the one true God. Do not negotiate the oneness of God. Old Testament. In the New Testament, your faith is placed, now watch this please, your faith is placed on the God who not only was born, walked among us, went to a Roman cross, was placed on a graveside, and came out of the graveside. That's where our faith is placed. But that faith is translated that although you have gone asleep, although you are going to experience physical death, you process the losses, you process death, you process whatever you're going through right now through the ability, through the certainty of what is to come. So we call this to process the immediate through the ultimate. That is exactly what faith does when it's placed in the character and the person of God. I'm going to say that again, because this is extremely important. See, you have to make sure that your faith is translated, that in the context of lust, in the context of losing, in the context of grief, in the context of confusion, in the context of seeing a generation that is moving deeper and deeper into rebellion against God, we do not lose heart. In other words, Paul is speaking this message, not necessarily thinking of the future or the better version of the Corinthians. Paul is speaking to the reality of a church that is confused, that is indulging themselves into sinful practices, and yet he reminds them that the answer to their situation is not just the transformation of their behavior. As important as behavior is, their issue is not their behavior. The behavior is simply the consequences or the symptoms of the actual problem. The problem for this generation 2,000 years ago, and then Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, is exactly the object, the reason of their faith, which in this case has been negotiated. And that's exactly where the problem resided 2,000 years ago in Moses' generation, and I believe this is exactly where we are today. So the question is, where have we placed our faith? Who or what is the object of our faith? And this is extremely important today, because we can speak of the resurrection, we can speak of any other subject in life. And as important as those subjects potentially are in our lives, bottom line is, as we have been entrusted with the ability to make choices, the reality is, how are those choices reflecting the object, the reason of that faith, of that choice? That's where we're going to come into this challenge. You know, we're going to look at next week into the remaining of the exercise. This is just half of it. And I promise you, the remaining of the exercise is extremely helpful, It's going to take it home. It's going to place us, it's going to take us, every one of us, into the challenge to really come into the realization that ultimately that faith has to be reflected into a life of faithfulness. Faith must be translated into faithfulness. The beauty of this, and I'll just give you kind of the heads up of what's coming, is that the faithfulness that we're describing is not our faithfulness. It's exactly the faithfulness of the God of the Bible, dealing, negotiating, working through a generation of unfaithfulness. Exactly in the book of Deuteronomy. You turn the page from Deuteronomy, you go into the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and eventually you go into the exile, into the actual crystallization of the lack of faithfulness to God. And here we are, 2,000 years ago of these conversations, and the God of the Bible continues to speak because He is faithful. So our faith ultimately is placed on the faithfulness of God. Our faith is placed on the reliance of God, on the trustworthiness of the God of the Bible, which you and I know. We can count on those things. How do we know that? Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you guys next time. God bless.